So welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's talk. I am Carrie Burkle, the Director of Textile Arts Los Angeles, and Textile Arts LA was co-founded in 2017 with Leslie Roberts and me. Textile Arts Los Angeles is an arts organization dedicated to promoting the textile arts and artists in Los Angeles and Southern California. Our members include artisans, designers, exhibitors, students, educators, gallery owners, and enthusiasts like yourselves. We highlight and promote the local textile arts community, organize original programming and events, and provide helpful resources to our members. Examples of our programming are gallery and studio visits, workshops, and talks by curators like Jennifer today. Welcome to our talk today, Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories, with the curator of the exhibition, Jennifer Swope. And I'd like to formally introduce Jennifer. Jennifer Swope is the David and Roberta Logie Associate Curator of Textiles and Fashion Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. She attended the Wintenther Program in American Culture as a Lewis F. McNeill Fellow, receiving a master's degree in American Material Culture from the University of Delaware. Jennifer is the co-author and curator of Quilts in Color, the Pilgrim Roy Collection, a catalog and exhibition that opened at the Museum of Fine Arts in 2014. She most recently co-authored the publication Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories, and curated the exhibition of the same title. The exhibition opened at the Museum of Fine Arts in October 2021 and is currently at the Skirball Cultural Center here in Los Angeles until March 12, 2023, and it will next travel to the Cummer Museum in Jackson, Florida, where it will open July 5th, 2024. And with that, I welcome Jennifer Swope.
Well, thank you, Carrie. That is just a marvelous welcome. And I'm really excited today to essentially sort of give a virtual tour of an exhibition that you'll see so many people have contributed to. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So if everyone can just be a little patient with me as we get going here. And we'll start at the beginning, which is always a good place. I had the pleasure of meeting Carrie when I was out for the installation and fell in love with Los Angeles, with all the art, with amazing food. And so Carrie, you were a wonderful host and made me feel very at home, which I'm sure many of you know when you're away from home doing work, it's very nice to connect with people with whom you share a deep interest in. And so thank you, Carrie, for arranging this today. We'll walk through the exhibition together. For those of you who have not had a chance to see Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories, it is on loan. It is an exhibition that opened at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, in November 2021, which just seems so long ago. It was conceived of before the pandemic. And it's just been very interesting to see how the pandemic and the circumstances around an exhibition really change it, and particularly in a second venue in Los Angeles. So one of the things that was really fun to think about at the Skirball Cultural Center was how the campus is absolutely beautiful. If you've never been there, it was designed by architect Moshe Safdie, and he created a beautiful museum building. And in the lower floors, there are the Noah's Ark, which is on permanent display with these figures, which is, I think my sense was like, that's sort of how a lot of people know about the Skirball Cultural Center is through the Noah's Ark, and a lot of sort of grandparents bringing their grandchildren to see the Noah's Ark. And then they have this long gallery that's about 5,000 square feet, and they've had other exhibitions there. But this was the first exhibition that they've had in this space since the pandemic, since actually just before the pandemic. So and they have a fabulous designer who knows the space inside and out. One thing that Moshe Safdie did, which I thought was just was very special for me, was that you can see he designed this ceiling, this sort of barrel vaulted, looks sort of like a barrel vaulted ceiling. And this for me was, and I think you'll appreciate this as artists and designers, this for me was very exciting, because usually a space is just lit from the ceiling and everything above the ceiling is black. So the ceiling height kind of disappears, but that the ceiling was an element and was curved. And then the designer placed the Virginia Jacobs ball quilt, which is 7 feet in diameter. It's called Krakow Kabuki Waltz. She made it in 1987. In her spare time, she worked in an architecture firm and came home and made this because she was doing a lot of experiments with structural quilts and three-dimensional quilts. And so this relationship between the geometry of the works of art and the geometry of the space it was very exciting for all of us. I was joined by two textile conservators and for the installation from the Museum of Fine Arts, and we worked very closely with the Skirball team. The exhibition is actually presented, the works of art are presented in a rough or loose chronological organization. And but there are certain themes that we wanted to emphasize, which I'll talk about as we walk through the exhibition. The exhibition and the publication actually have a flipped relationship. Usually a publication is conceived of either in parallel to an exhibition, it's an exhibition catalog. This was actually very different. We, working with my former colleagues, Pam Parmel, who is Emeritus Chair of the Textile and Fashion Arts Department at the MFA, and Lauren Whitley, who is Senior Curator Emeritus. We thought in around 2017, when this organization was formed, we should do a publication of highlights from the American Quilt collection. The MFA has had the Harriet Powers pictorial quilt in its collection since 1964. This incredible, I mean, it's a national treasure. This actually has always been a celebrated and recognized important artwork in the museum's collection, but the MFA really didn't have that great a quilt collection for most of its history. This was actually brought in as part of a larger folk art collection. And while it's obviously recognized as a quilt, it was kind of always thought of more as part of the museum's folk art collection generally.
Jennifer,
yeah,
I hate to
yes.
stop and interrupt you, but I'm going to have to ask everyone to please look and mute yourself, because there's extraneous noise coming through. So everyone, please mute yourself. Thank you. Okay, sorry, Jennifer.
Thank you, Carrie. No problem. And what happened, so in looking at, and there were quilts in the collection, they tended to either come in as folk art objects, or they also were acquired often as, they came in with larger groups of household textiles, or historic clothing or historic fashion that people might have had in their families. So very skewed toward New England, elite families, so 17th, 18th, 19th century material, textiles and fashion. And but the MFA had never really seriously collected or purposely collected American quilts. So in 1999, my Pam Parmel and Ann Coleman, who was then chair of the Textile and Fashion Arts Department, decided to change that. And so this acquisition of a gorgeous example of a Baltimore album quilt was acquired then. And that really is what was the catalyst for creating a collection that now includes a little over 300 examples of American quilts. Again, how you define that, I tend to define them as quilts made and used in America, owned by American families. And so that's really what got us started. So by the time we got to about, particularly after the Quilts in Color exhibition in 2014, we could look back on about 20 years of seriously collecting quilts, and we were ready to have this publication, which the publication is organized chronologically and includes about 63 works of art. And for both the publication and the exhibition, as textile curators, we kept calling it as like, oh, the quilt and bed cover project, or quilts and coverlets. And because the nature of working in a larger art museum, by the time we got to the point where we were working on a publication and then eventually an exhibition, we were told by our colleagues, you can't use the word coverlet or bed cover because it makes people sleepy. So we used quilts in a very broad way to represent quilts, bed covers of all sorts, and then art objects that are inspired by those things. So one example is a very extraordinary Rio Grande blanket that was made in the mid 19th century. And this is actually it's to be broader in that definition, or that way of thinking about quilts and bed covers was very helpful, because we do have such a wonderful collection of American textiles. We didn't really want to leave anything out, and it gave us the opportunity to compare that Baltimore album quilt that I showed you, which was made about the same time as this Rio Grande blanket. Which doesn't usually happen. Usually sort of, the quilt scholars usually want to talk about they want to talk about Baltimore album quilts as a separate topic. And so we wanted to be very broad and bring people into essentially a North American conversation. Another thing that we learned from the project Quilts in Color was that it's very important to, particularly in an art museum context, where a lot of what we essentially is to demonstrate that these textiles are works of art. And so it's very important to upend, challenge, surprise, and delight visitors by not delivering what is expected from quilts. So I always think of, when you say quilts, I think, oh, like, cue the rooster and let's hear, the fiddle. So this is actually, and it's very interesting when you go and see the exhibition, or if you look at the book, there are very few examples of ordinary quilts, because it's an art museum collection. And so this is a beautiful pieced quilt from the second quarter of the 19th century, and in many ways conforms to this idea of an American quilt. And you can almost sort of imagine the quilting bee that this might have been pieced and quilted together at. But it's an extraordinary example of its type, and both for how it's preserved and also how this furnishing chintz border is used. So it's a very typical composition, in the sense that's, this pieced pattern in the center is still used today, or continued to be used, but it looks like it just came off the frame. So it is a very special example of its type. And, most of these quilts, if they were made to be functioning, they have been taken out of that context. But we wanted to make sure that people kind of remembered that context also, even as we challenge their expectations and definitions of a quilt. So we knew, if we said, okay, we've got this great collection of bed covers and quilts made and used in what we think of as the United States or North America, from the late 17th century all the way through to contemporary examples. This is going to be quite a project to tell that broad a story. And so we started very early in 2018 working on the book, bringing people in and asking them questions, showing them a quilt. And we asked artists to come by. We asked scholars. We asked people who were community members, who were sometimes artist activists. And one of the artists in Boston who's just been incredibly helpful to us in many ways is Stephen Hamilton. He works in textiles and has spent a significant amount of time in Nigeria, actually studying indigo dyeing, as well as spinning and weaving. And this was his class that he brought to the Textile and Fashion Arts Department. It was a high school students, special program for high school students, and they were learning from him how to make textile works of art using traditional Nigerian indigo dyeing and spinning and weaving, and also with the resist techniques for making patterns, and then also painting. And they were just amazing. And while we were there, we looked at African textiles together. And every time Stephen talks about our African textile collection, I always learn something. And because he's an artist and maker and understands on a very deep level. And then we got out this Annie Mae Williams quilt, which was actually, Annie Mae Williams was from Gee's Bend. She made this quilt during the Quilts of Gee's Bend exhibition that traveled to 9 different museums, including the Museum of Fine Arts, between 2004 and 2006. And this piece was donated during that time. It was not in the exhibition. And she didn't make it as a functional quilt. She made it like a functional quilt, but it was sold in a gallery. It's made from older clothes and newer pieces of cloth. And to hear him speak about quilts and how, for him, they are his artistic legacy. So he remembered his great-grandmother's quilts and how they were distributed in his family, and how sadly many were lost in his fire in his great-aunt's house. And how he was able to captivate the attention of his students, which he's an amazing teacher. But talking about this quilt, the light just turned on, and we realized that we really had something special that we could connect with so many of our visitors on a much deeper way than could be done with. And I love paintings, but that could be done with maybe two-dimensional works of art that are more likely to be considered fine art. The other thing that Stephen did, which was so fascinating, because he has such experience and knowledge of indigo and indigo dyeing, we of course invited him back, and we along with Stephen Hamilton and about 10 other people who work in the museum, in the curatorial departments and in interpretation and design, and then also a number of other local scholars. And we were all looking at this quilt on the left, which is a whole cloth wool quilt made in the Connecticut River Valley, so Western Massachusetts or Connecticut, where the Connecticut River flows through. And they're made from a wool that was made in Great Britain and imported, so they would have been very expensive to make. And the back side of the quilt is homespun wool. So the imported expensive material goes on top, and then the less expensive material goes underneath. There's a wool batting. And the shininess comes from a calendaring, so essentially like smoothing out the wool fabric after it's been woven between two stones or rollers that are very heavy and heat, also like over ironing your wool pants. And so I was ready to sort of think about this as, well, they grew tobacco in Western Massachusetts and Connecticut all the way into the 20th century in Connecticut. And many on those plantations, which is what they were called, enslaved people and indentured servants provided the labor that made that tobacco, made the growth and cultivation of that tobacco possible, which then funded the wealth of the owners of the plantation and enabled something like this to be made, which would have gone on a bed, perhaps, even in a bed in a parlor or a main space that someone would see, and maybe a chamber upstairs. And but then Stephen just turned it all on its end. And he said, I see the knowledge that women from West Africa who were brought to North America as enslaved people brought to the cultivation and raising of indigo in South Carolina in the 18th century when it became a cash crop. So that, and it takes a great deal of skill to actually grow and cultivate indigo and produce it at the scale in which it was produced, and especially supported the British Empire. So that's sort of where we thought, like, okay, what can we do? Can we tell stories with textiles that go across time? And Carrie, you had said to me that several people had asked you sort of like, well, why is this Roland Ricketts piece, which is on the far right? Why did we include that? Because it's definitely not a quilt. And in it, we wanted to bring this indigo story to the 21st century, like we were able to do with Tomie Nagano's piece in the center, Indigo Color Mixture. And she is a Japanese American textile artist, reusing old indigo, in this case, indigo dyed textiles from kimono and other clothing worn in the 19th century by her grandparents, and then also people in her grandparents' generation. So it's about memory and remembering. And then Roland Ricketts' piece is deliberately he raises his own indigo and dyes the ground of his weaving, which is actually a linen paper himself, with indigo that he cultivates in the way that Japanese indigo is cultivated, which is fermented in a different way than this was done in the 18th century, very deliberately. So he's examining actually the past of textile making, indigo dyeing, coverlet weaving, and trying to bring those issues back through his art and make them relevant. So that enabled us to have this indigo corner here in the section of the exhibition called Unseen Hands, where we have works of art like this late 17th, early 18th century whole cloth quilt made of this red silk satin that was owned by a family in Boston and passed down many generations, but it was made in London in a professional workshop. So it could have been actually quilted by men. And it is unbelievable in its scale and its preservation over time. So this section, and so I'm sort of leaping ahead from the entrance, but this section, along with that flows into Crafting a Nation, which includes our 19th century quilts, is essentially the most historic, but even then we wanted to, or most chronologically, stays most chronologically within the lines of progressing from the late 17th through the mid 19th century. But even with the Roland Ricketts and with the Tomie Nagano pieces, we wanted to sort of jump out of that chronology, again, because we wanted to exceed people's expectations of a quilt exhibitions, because so often they start at the beginning of time and then they go up to the present day. So the other thing that Stephen Hamilton did during the thing where he talked about the blue whole cloth quilt from the Connecticut River Valley is he pulled out his phone, and this was during like Miami Basel, and which I've never been to, but I've heard is a very, very exciting place to be to look at contemporary art. And he said, "Have you seen this? Do you know about Bisa Butler?" And he pointed at his phone. He's like, "You need a Bisa Butler." So that's how I learned about Bisa Butler. And so, like all good things, we were all really excited when we saw her work. And we didn't actually see this. I think we saw something else that was on display in Miami Basel. So we didn't know that this piece existed. And it was very clear as soon as we saw this work, which is, 140 inches wide. The figures are slightly larger than human scale, but basically human scale. And Bisa Butler works from these, often very small black and white photographs. The photograph on the right is of the Morris Brown baseball team, probably taken around 1899. It was a photograph owned by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it was shown at the Paris Exposition of 1900. It was probably he included about 300 photographs of African Americans to demonstrate progress after emancipation. So this was one of the photographs that was included in that exhibition. And you can see she made some, took some artistic license. This man, I don't know if he's the coach, he's been left out. And she uses kente and other African strip woven cloth. She uses the resist dyed Dutch wax patterns that often have very specific meanings in Africa. This one that's used in several pieces is of the horse, which is called I Can Run Faster Than My Enemies in French in the Ivory Coast. And so it's about athletic prowess. And the fish scale pattern that appears in many of these. Actually, what someone I saw in the exhibition who visited had a bag with that same fish scale pattern, so that was amazing. That is about has a relationship to teamwork, because this is a team of coming together, many parts coming together. And so my co-author on the book, Lauren Whitley, who's the senior curator I spoke to you about, we got on a plane and we flew to northern New Jersey. And we met Bisa Butler in what she's since moved, but this was her house and studio. And if you look carefully, so she hung it up for us across her living room. And if you look carefully, see, it hasn't been quilted yet. So she had just made all the figures. She'd sewn all the figures, and she'd pinned them to the background, which is a satin weave. And she flips, actually, the blue and black is the backside of the satin weave, so it's a little less shiny. And then she called it her audition. So she would arrange all the figures on this back cloth, pin it in place, and then decided that's what she wanted. And then she would go to her quilting machine, which is behind me on the sunroom. And you can see it in the video that is right next to the quilt. So it was very exciting for us to see it in process, essentially. And so we knew when we saw that, we were just so fortunate to have, we had the cover for the book. We wanted this to be, the work of art that was going to be the feature. And that was about the same time that the museum gave us the green light to think of this as an exhibition. So all of this sort of exciting thing, this exciting momentum coincided and was really dependent on the contributions of many other people who really wanted to see this project and wanted to see these works of art brought to larger audiences so they could be appreciated. And so that's sort of why we didn't, that's one reason why we didn't want to have a chronological sort of march through time with the quilts. And I think we always wanted to, because we were always being asked, like, what's so American about quilts? Why are they American? And then we thought, well, let's take the question back even farther, like, what's America? Is it the United States? Is it just North America? And so these three quilts that are in this, they're not, and of course, they're not even all quilts. These three textiles that could be thought of as bed covers were made generally as bed covers in flag patterns were sort of the perfect way to start the exhibition. And I should say also that Pam Parmel and Lauren Whitley and I worked very closely with our colleagues in interpretation and in design, really right from the beginning, as soon as we got the green light for the exhibition. And so our designer, Kyla Hajison, she said, well, why don't we have like this curved wall in the beginning? And then we could put these three quilts up in this flag pattern. One is the Irene Williams 1975 Vote quilt. Irene Williams was an artist quilter who lived in Gee's Bend, Alabama. This one in the center is a Dene or Navajo weaving. We don't know the name of the maker, which is not uncommon. And this was made for the person for whom she worked as a domestic servant for, who was the Surgeon General of the New Mexico Territory and was one of the signers of the Navajo Nation Treaty. So it was probably made in Santa Fe sometime after 1868. And then one of my favorites, of course, is the Hoosier suffrage quilt with names of nearly 300 names, all representing, embroidered on the quilt, all representing people who were contributing to what I think was an effort to ratify the 19th Amendment in Indiana, which was one of the last, not the last state, but one of the last states to ratify the amendment in January 1920. And that was so we wanted to really start in a graphically, strong way and ask these questions, like who is considered American, who considers themselves American, and what is it? What is America? And this was before the pandemic, and it turned out to be a great question to ask as we found ourselves in the pandemic. The other thing I love to say about quilt shows, at least the two I've had the privilege of working on, is that it takes many hands to lift a quilt show. So the largest quilt, the widest quilt at least, is the Bisa Butler quilt. And this is titled To God in Truth. It's 140 inches wide. And so Meredith Montague, who you can see here in the black sweater, she devised this way of hanging this quilt, which is essentially like hoisting the sails in a square rigger. So with this plastic sheeting, so there's no friction on, she has everyone lay it out lays the plastic sheeting down, then the quilt goes down on the floor. And then without any friction, it is hoisted up. There are pulleys up here that you can see. And with that, it gets in position, and then it is actually just anchored in with hooks. When people see this quilt, I don't know and I'm interested after I'm done speaking to hear what people's impressions are. Even if they've seen reproductions of it, even if they've gotten the book, maybe they've seen the quilt on a banner, they're really I would say everyone who's shared comments with me is just generally and genuinely just amazed at the likeness of the figures and their presence in the room. To have that quilt, To God in Truth, which is based on this photograph from 1899 that the artist has interpreted in this space with our Scenes of American Life quilt, which was made probably in the early 1920s. We don't know the maker. With the Skirball Cultural Center's own Ellis Island quilt that was made in the I think it was made in 1996 by the Hamish Amish. This was such a great, genius idea of the curator at the Skirball Cultural Center, Danny Killam, who I'll show an image of later. This was normally on view in the Skirball's permanent gallery space, which is devoted to immigration. And the Hamish Amish, they were a group of quilters, 9, and one is still living, Barbara Vogel, and she came to the opening. And in the 1970s, there was a quilt show, or 80s, there was a quilt show in Los Angeles on Amish quilts. And these women said, hey, we want to be a quilt group. And so they called themselves the Hamish Amish. And Hamish means welcome and home and hospitality. And so they made this quilt, and they used images that you would recognize from the Lower East Side of New York, and that show immigration, but also people that in their own families who had immigrated through Ellis Island. And it's a marvelous quilt. And the space itself is just they all talk to each other. And then, so when we got to this point of really thinking about this project as an exhibition, thankfully we had the publication pretty much in hand. We were still writing, so we were able to do a lot of deep research on these quilts. We had the opportunity to, at the Museum of Fine Arts, we were able to borrow the other quilt that survives from Harriet Powers and show both the MFA's pictorial quilt that I showed you an image of and Harriet Powers' Bible quilt, which was made about 10 years earlier and had been displayed at the Cotton States Fair in Atlanta in 1885. So 2 really important quilts were going to be shown together. They were never shown together during Harriet Powers' lifetime. And we sensed this as like, wow, this is a really important moment. And so we brought together a group, and it was under this program titled, that we still call Table of Voices. And of course, the pandemic had just started when we formed the Table of Voices. So all of the meetings were done virtually, which actually worked out very well because all the people on the screen live live mostly in the Northeast, but it would have been hard to get everybody around a table 3 times. And Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who wrote the introduction to the book, is a Pulitzer Prize winning historian who is now a curator, or is now a historian emeritus at Harvard. Kyra Hicks, who wrote All That She Carried, actually is a historian at Harvard whose office was Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's old office. She you will hear her voice if you go see the Harriet Powers quilt at the Skirball. She joined us for this table of voices. Lamerche Frazier, who's in the center, she's an artist and activist in Boston who's done a lot of work in textiles. And Gail Willett is a quilter and a librarian from Cambridge, and is working in the nutrition field to make people's lives better. Kyra Hicks on the far right has written, I think, the best book on Harriet Powers and the Harriet Powers quilts, This I Accomplish, lives in Maryland. And then this is Michael Thorpe, whose work you'll see in a little bit. He grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, so just very close to Boston, lives in New York now. And he'd studied photography, and his mother is a quilter and his aunt is a quilter, and his mother got a long arm quilting machine and he basically took it over. She was very kind to share it with him. And so like many artists, he comes from quilts and textiles in a circuitous route. So the Harriet Powers quilt, we wanted to interpret it sensitively. We wanted to make sure that there's been a lot of myth making around the Harriet Powers quilt, and we wanted to make sure that people who saw this quilt understood that she saw herself and what she made. She saw herself as an artist, the way we would think of an artist, and what she made as art, the way we think of art. She called her quilts like the children of her mind, of her imagination. She was telling stories through quilts that had great meaning to her and the people who saw her quilts and celebrated them. They were very, because the Bible quilt, which is in the Smithsonian, was shown at the Cotton States Fair. They were probably also shown at other cotton fairs and other local fairs. She was quoted in newspapers, or it was quoted in newspapers, stories that were syndicated around the country at the time of the late 19th century. And this quilt, which is a national treasure, is in a section titled Quilts as Art. And if we think about the late 19th century, there really weren't very many art museums, right? There certainly were very few art galleries. And so these fairs, whether they were international World's Fairs or whether they were local fairs, local agricultural fairs, church fairs, civic fairs, they were sort of our as a nation, they were our ad hoc art museums. And so we wanted to bring people into that story. And so please, when you go, take a moment and watch the video, and take a look at this piece that we've reproduced here, which shows the tiny carte de visite. It's about this big, which is a portrait of Harriet Powers, dressed in an apron with this reverse applique star, just like you'll see the reverse applique on the quilt, holding in her hand a piece of cloth that she is sewing. She deliberately had her portrait photograph taken just the way Rembrandt might have shown himself in a self-portrait with a paintbrush. She was saying, "This is what I do. This is." So it's, every time I think about that, I get very very excited that we can the MFA can share this treasure with people on the other side of the country. And then again, it's in this section called Quilts as Art. This is a wonderful coverlet from the Centennial exhibition, which did have an art building. And although the quilts rarely were in the actual art buildings of these fairs, usually they were in the sort of women's building or the domestic arts building. And then this wonderful railroad quilt, which is appliqued, that was probably made for the Pan American exhibition. So to go back to Michael Thorpe and the one section before that called Conflict Without Resolution, the this actually, so just to be very candid about where we were, the pandemic hit. I was on furlough, and so Pam and Lauren were moving forward with the exhibition, and the then head of interpretation and Andrew Tessieri, he saw a post by Michael Thorpe, who was still living in Boston, of this untitled quilt that's appliqued with the words Black man, the day after the murder of George Floyd. So he woke up, he made this quilt, and he put it on his Instagram page with almost sort of a stream of consciousness sort of poem about what it was like to be seen as Black, as a Black man at that moment. And it's interesting because most of Michael Thorpe's work is actually not they're not quick responses. They're actually like very carefully laid out and thoughtfully constructed, or very deliberately constructed quilts. And so Adam just bought it and he gave it to the museum. And again, it was like seeing the Bisa Butler quilt. It just like had this light switch effect. And with it, we realized, like, okay, so we have chronologically, after Crafting a Nation, which takes us to the mid-19th century, we have this, we kept calling it the Civil War section. We have a Civil War quilt, which you'll have a chance to see. But, what was really like the legacy of the Civil War? And so we wanted in the middle of the exhibition to rethink that section and include works like Dr. Carolyn Matsloumi's Strange Fruit, which in a way that you cannot escape from. I asked her once, well, you used to work in color. Why are your quilts now black and white? Because this is a silk screened piece that then is, so it's a flat piece of cloth, and she designs that design, has it silk screened, and then quilts it. And she said that, she felt that the black and white, the graphic, the negative positive space in black and white, didn't give people anywhere to go. They had to confront what they were visually seeing in the quilt. And this section also, we had a lot of discussions internally about how to show this quilt in a way that was culturally sensitive in the moment that we were in, particularly. And we talked a lot about, like, should we have this in a place that's a little separate, with like sort of a warning about the lynched figures and the Ku Klux Klan figures. And then we decided we should have it all together. And we were really fortunate to be able to create an audio guide, so we could have the voice of artists like Dr. Carolyn Matsloumi really featured, so that, and then we also were able to create essentially labels as long as we needed to, because they're on a railing that's lower than the quilt. So they're not on the wall next to the quilt. It's just harder to read. So in that way, we hoped we were able to put quilts from the 19th century. This is the Civil War quilt that I spoke of, in the context of contemporary works that spoke to the legacy of slavery and the Civil War. And the curator, Danny Killam, who I've already spoke of, she included this work by a Los Angeles artist named Ramesses. This was his first quilt that he ever made in 2006. Again, using a historic photograph that had been published in the newspaper of Ruby Bridges. You can see her here, who was desegregated her school in Los Angeles, in Louisiana. And so Ramesses, like so many of the artists in this exhibition, he was an illustrator for the Los Angeles Times for many years and came to quilting, just discovered it himself. And he travels around to musical festivals. That's why he was in Louisiana, and he met Ruby Bridges and showed her this quilt. And just he does it because he loves it, and he loves, he often makes quilts of musicians. And I think that again shows something that we wanted to do here, which is bring people together with this sort of shared curiosity. This was also a moment in the exhibition, and actually working with our Table of Voices consulting group, they said, well, this is a very heavy part of the exhibition. You should have an opportunity for a timeout, for reflection. And so the designer at the Skirball put, which I thought was beautiful, Dr. Carolyn Mutzlumi's quote from the New York Times, which basically paraphrases something that she's said a number of times to me, which is that quilts are a soft landing for tough conversations, which I think just perfectly summarizes the exhibition. And then right next to it, we put our what one of the reviewers of the Boston Globe described as a silky hide. But the tactileness of all of these works of art, is very frustrating for visitors because they want to touch. So we gave them a place to touch and leave their comments. And it's essentially 2 pieces of nylon carpet that are stapled to the wall, very close together. And it is always my pleasure when the show was up at the Museum of Fine Arts, I would take a picture of the carpet on the wall before I would comb it out, so that we would invite people to make their mark. And a lot of visitors were very hesitant to do this, so I would have to make a mark on it because many visitors are very considerate and don't want to touch anything on the walls. And then so the section after Conflict Without Resolution and then Quilts as Art is modern myths, and really in the beginning of the 20th century, moving out of the 19th century, this is when quilts really became very associated with as an American art form, a democratic art form, a kitchen table art form, and a lot of that is, of course, not true, because quilts are made all over the world throughout history. But this was done, and reinforced in the 1970s with Amish quilts, like you can see this one on the left, and made of wool, and from Pennsylvania, classic stripe design, strip quilt design. And then much later in the 20th, or not much later, but yeah, about a quarter century later, with the Quilts of Gee's Bend, traveling, it's opening at the Houston Art Museum, traveling to the Whitney and the MFA, the Milwaukee Art Museum. So, these abstract geometric quilts that were made to be functional were sort of taken up by the art world because they connected visually to abstract 20th century painting and color theory. And that just cracked open the door, I think, to looking at these works as art. We did have a few loans in the exhibition. Most of the quilts in the exhibition and all the quilts in the publication are part of the MFA's collection. But one thing that we wanted to address was really the dearth of Asian American quilts and large textile works of art. And so we borrowed from the National Japanese American Historical Society in San Francisco a quilt that was made in the Poston Relocation Center in Arizona. And many of the pieces in this exhibition, we've received a number of very thoughtful comments about it. It was made in an elementary school classroom taught by Misaka Hirihata, and it was put together by her sister, who was also imprisoned in the camp. And the students, you can see there's a photograph when you go and see it of them working in the classroom. They all embroidered their names on each block, and the decorative fabric that's a red and white print was donated by a family at the camp. And they were doing a unit on pioneerism, and so they wanted to create a quilt that was like something that would have been made by a pioneer mother in the 19th century. So with these sort of a combination of quilts made in various circumstances in the first 3/4 of the 20th century, we have the modern myths section, another beautiful quilt from Gee's Bend, Alabama, made by Lillian Petway, whose daughter Marianne is still in Gee's Bend and still quilting. So we wanted to remind people that quilting is alive and well. And then I call this the happiness corner. This is a quilt that was shown. It's called the Spectrum, and it was one of the prize winners of the Sears Quilt Contest for the Chicago World's Fair, and was shown there in the summer of 1934. And next to our wonderful double wedding ring, which was made by an unknown African-American woman. It was acquired in Jefferson City, Missouri, by the collectors who donated it to the MFA. And when this was up at the Museum of Fine Arts, a couple came in, 2 women, and one proposed marriage to the other. And so I'm waiting to hear. That hasn't happened yet, but we've got till March 12th. And then leading into that, we have the Making a Difference section, which we had a hard time coming up with a title for. But in it, you will see a lot of work by women in particular, and some men, one man, who came to quilting starting in the 70s and then the 80s and the 90s. Through to the 21st century, from various angles, and some with art degrees. This was made by Molly Upton, who is a good friend of Susan Hoffman. They were sort of artistic partners who created their own they created their own studio, making quilts together with different aesthetic challenges. And it really is a testament to, again, sort of like the ball quilt made by Virginia Jacobs, people just deciding that this is a medium that I want to explore, whether it is recognized by the art world or not, whether I have an audience for this or not. And then we were so fortunate, again, this was one of the last pieces that we were able to acquire, so it's not in the publication, but the beauty, and I think the conceptual lift given by Jennifer Swope to, this is Love Letter 5. It's a series that she made in 2021. And in it, she makes portraits of friends and relatives and people that she meets actually online. And she kept doing this during the pandemic. And in it, she's using pieces of cloth appliqued onto this print ground, which is stretched on a canvas. And it is an homage and celebration of her aunties, her grandmother, her mother, who would make clothes together in community for each other, for the people who they loved, and is very connected to Black joy. And so, this last section is in some ways it was the hardest, I think, for our designer at the MFA to deal with, because the work is also different. So she sort of created this white wall gallery space for it. And I think here it actually flows quite well from modern myths. On the right is also a late acquisition in the process by Sylvia Hernandez. It was made in 2018, partly in response to the shooting in Parkland, Florida. And on the left is Carla Hemlock's Survivors, which includes, this is all pieced by machine and then hand quilted. She's also a very accomplished beadwork artist. She's Mohawk and lives in Ganawage, just south of Montreal. And in it, she uses this traditional, what's called a settler or a European white pattern, and but she's integrated these pieced wampum figures. So the wampum figures are a reference to wampum belts, which are taken out every year in her community of Ganawage. Her son is now one of the recounters of the stories told by the wampum belts. And since the 17th century, these belts have come out, and the community retells the story of their community every single year. On the outer section is a red beadwork of 48 Native or Indigenous nations who survive today. And so that's why it's called Survivors. And then, this is the whole purpose of this exhibition, is getting people to look, essentially encouraging people to look. So this beautiful quilt that has like all of the artistry, this incredible design. And when we were installing at the Skirball, Brian and Stez were looking at this, and I could hear them, and they were talking about it, and they were talking about the figures, and they were talking about the quilting pattern, and they were talking about the geometry, and because we hadn't put a label up, so they didn't know anything about it. And that's really, that's where, that's our goal in putting this work out. And I just wanted to make sure that everyone could see Danny Killam here, who is the curator at the Skirball. She couldn't join us today. And she's working in a different museum now, but again, Danny and everyone at the Skirball, all the staff and the administration, they really took good care of this exhibition. They took its concept seriously. They took all the works of art seriously. And I was telling Danny that it was a little like sending a kid to college. You're just like, I hope it's going to be okay. And here she is. She's speaking to a group actually from the Huntington Museum who came to visit during the preview period about a Sabrina Gushfontner work of art, a film quilt that's based on it's from the Mandarin Film Company, which was established in Oakland in the 19-teens by Marion E. Wong. Again, pointing out how, and Sabrina Gushfontner's work is amazing. We had one of her works on view at when the exhibition was at the MFA, but it couldn't travel. So Danny was very resourceful and made a connection and got this piece up. So it's open until March 12th. I hope that you can visit, and I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I would love to hear from all of you.
Oh my gosh, Jennifer.
I hope I didn't talk for too long.
It was such an education and a pleasure to get your insight behind all of those quilts, because now I'm going to go take a second look for sure.
Good.
Just so mindful about the power of cloth, the simplicity of cloth, the availability of cloth, but how it can express multitudes of ideas. So thank you.
I think I will quote you. You're welcome. I'm going to use your quote. And that is exactly what we want people to, the immediacy of quilts, however you think about a quilt, is so powerful and so relevant. And I was thinking, we've had a number of talks about the, particularly that section, the conflict without resolution section, and what is that going to mean to people in over a year, when it's on view at the Kummer Museum. But then I was listening to the radio today and I heard something horrible, not to, this is such a special moment, but there's this horrible movement of National Hate Day. And I was like, this is just like, we need to keep doing this. We need to keep putting works of art on view and creating community through art, because I really do believe that it does, it's not going to open everyone's mind, but it gives me hope that art can be used in a positive way and can affect people positively.
Yes, I'm most definitely. We did have a question from Lee Wishner she wanted to know if any of the quilts were done by the pattern and decorative arts artist. Did I get that right?
Oh yes, that's a very good question. When before the pandemic, we didn't actually talk about the pattern and decorative arts artists, but we did talk about possibly borrowing one of the banners that was part of the dinner party by Judy Chicago, which is at the Brooklyn Art Museum. And then honestly, like we have one work of art by Judy Chicago, and it's not a textile in the MFA. So there were only four loans actually in the whole exhibition. And so that would have been one of the I called them strategic loans at the time. Thank you, pattern and decoration. And so essentially we hit a don't know what you would call it, sort of we hit a wall with the pandemic where the loans that we had were all the loans we could deal with at that point because of changes in staff and the pandemic. And I mean, essentially, it's so hard to remember that, like, it's like no one wants to remember this because it was so awful. But I mean, museums were really thrown through a loop by the pandemic. So that this went up at all was really a testament to the support that we had internally for the project. And so that is why that is a noted absence. Another noted absence is that we don't have a Hawaiian quilt, which is like a very obvious way to like expand the notion of America and what is American. And and again, that just comes from, we thought about borrowing a Hawaiian quilt, and, we sort of just, it was pencils down, and we had to put up what we had. As far as, I see a question in the chat about how they were physically hung. So I realized it was a little deceptive because I showed 2 installation shots that were not typical of how the works were hung. Generally, the quilts are hung on a Z clip. So there's a Z clip that's attached to the wall. So it's a metal clip, basically a metal bar with an indentation. And then a strip is made of plywood that's probably about 4 inches wide. And on that strip is a piece of Velcro. And that gets clipped in. On the back of that is a Z clip, so that gets clipped in. And then on the quilt is like a piece of cloth or webbing, and then on that piece of webbing is sewn a piece of Velcro. So that strip, that plywood strip, and with its Velcro and its Z clip, with Velcro on one side, Z clip on the other side, is actually clipped to the wall that way. So it's very stable. And then the 4 inches of Velcro, that's pretty wide. So that gives the conservators a lot of play. And so they can make micro adjustments when it goes up. So there's one that is hung with like a sleeve and just a bar going through, but all the others are hung on a Z clip plywood system. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Then I'll give you another little tip. So what makes the show really cool, different from others that you'll see, is that you'll notice that like they really look like textiles on the wall. They don't look stretched. And that's because with this Velcro system, and then in the back of many of them on the lower corners, attached to the wall is a piece of foam. And that's covered with cloth. It usually matches, like it's usually dark, so it hides in the shadow. And then that piece of foam is like something that the conservators can put very thin pins through the quilt into the foam to just even out. Sometimes if you go see textiles on the wall, the way they have that wave, like you need a little bit of that wave or that undulation to remind people that they're looking at a textile. But if you don't want to see too much of that, so it helps kind of flatten them out enough on the wall that you can see the design on the face without it being distracting or without losing its quality of a hanging textile. If you want to do the same at home with yes, you could probably do the same thing at home. I think one thing that I've been told is very important, and I'm not a conservator, so I would defer to their expertise. You never want to sew Velcro directly to the textile. So you want to sew the Velcro to something else and then attach that to the textile so that you're distributing the tension that you're creating by hanging the piece. And also like the weight of the piece is determined in that too.
You see Elisa's
yes, the Sula. So that is something that that wonderful Los Angeles, California piece, which I think is described in the label as sort of an archaeological time capsule with pieces that Sula Bermudez Silverman found on the streets of Los Angeles, where she lives. That was made in 2020. And during the pandemic. And so she that was chosen by Danny Killam, who is the curator who I showed you, but I love how it came off the wall so you could see through it. And I think it just created that. And I love the colors next to the Lily Mae Petway piece from Gee's Bend. And that I just thought it was a really, I don't know if she came to the opening. I did not meet her, which is too bad because I would have loved to have met her. Joel Otterman, who made the piece just behind it, that's the settee, he was sick and he couldn't make it to the opening. So that was too bad. I did get to meet Ramesses, so that was exciting. And I saw Barbara Vogel, and I think I just got to meet her very shortly, which was disappointing because I would have loved to have talked to her more. But I think like the contemporary works that are from Los Angeles are so exciting in the exhibition. And I think that speaks to, again, this like terrific elasticity of the concept and the medium itself, that we could just, like, that Danny's ideas were so great to include Sula's piece, and that we wanted the works to have a dialogue with each other across time and space, because we want people to have dialogues with each other who are visiting across their own personal experiences. So thank you for asking about that.
That what that makes me think of is that it's easily accessible because that piece is plastic, it's see-through, it has pockets, it has stitching, it's sewn. And so it allows you the idea that a quilt does not have to be 3 layers or traditional, right? It's like stretching the idea of what a quilt can be. It gives us permission, I think, to think of quilts.
Yes, I think the tent is large and can fit many, many people. And I think that and when I was there, it was great. I mean, I think that Dennis Carr, who's a wonderful colleague at the Huntington, he said, quilts are really having a moment in Los Angeles. There were and textile art in general. I applaud all of you for keeping the flame burning, because there is I would say institutional interest ebbs and flows. And right now I think we're on an upswing, and I think it's very important to offer people who are come to cultural institutions or go to galleries or go to art school, to, as you said, Carrie, like, give them permission. If there's a medium, if there's something that you relate to the most, then you should be everyone has the right to imagine.
Well, it was just an absolutely gorgeous exhibit. You can't take all of the information in one walkthrough because it's so abundant and rich. So thank you so much for presenting today, Jennifer. I also want to give a shout out to Karen Hampton, who was from Los Angeles, who's now a professor in Massachusetts, who put us together. So thank you, Karen.
Yes, thank you, Karen.
Does anyone else have anything else they would like to add? There's a lot of accolades in the chat box, Jennifer.
Oh, I'm loving reading them all. Thank you all. Oh, and I like the heart too. And just it's just been wonderful to share this with all of you today. And I hope everyone has just a wonderful weekend and gets through the challenging weather. Think of quilts warming up, right?
Well, Erica wanted to know how long it took to create the exhibition.
The show.
It's such a good question. It was actually designed for 4 different there were 4 different designs that went through 3 different galleries. So it ended back in the gallery that it ended up being shown in. So it took a long time because we weren't sure when it was going to go up. So we kept redesigning it for possible spaces. So I would say it probably took about 8 months to design. And then it took us about 2.5, 3 years to write the book. So it was kind of really like a 5-year project, which is crazy because you're rarely given that much time. So the pandemic was both it was the curse, but it was also like the thing that made it, I think, actually better in the end, because it went through all of these iterations. It's a great question.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. This was recorded. I will let you know when it is up on our Vimeo account. And Jennifer Swope, thank you so much. It was delightful.
Thank you all.
So have a great Saturday, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Carrie. Thank you all.